welcome to Mimamsa Dialogues. Mimamsa Foundation is a forum where we attempt to study, understand India through various research articles, videos, podcasts, and also engage with a lot of different voices, different perspectives, different ideas who are understanding India and issues relevant to India in a well-rooted academic Indian way. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon sir. He has been a former foreign secretary. He has also been a national security advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And he's one of India's foremost strategic thinkers and experts on Indian foreign policy. And the occasion for today's discussion is his new book, India and the Asian Geopolitics, which is, to say the least, is one of the most, in a sense, an exhaustive and also comprehensive account of how India has looked at this region from an historical perspective and what this region is to offer us in future. And when it is coming from someone like Ambassador Menon, you can expect that it offers you plenty with respect to thoughts and ideas, which are thought-provoking, at times also very different and also radical. In this book, essentially, he offers a very deep insight into India's history in terms of foreign and security policy, offers a very critical reflection on present, and also gives a very contemplative account as to what India can expect of this region and what India should do or what India should be looking at or staring at. So I enjoyed reading this book immensely, and thank you, Ambassador Menon, for accepting this invitation, and congratulations for a wonderful book.
Thank you for having me. It's good of me, and thank you for saying such kind things about the book.
No, it is indeed. In fact, as a student of international relations, when I was going through that book, it was like going through the history like before 1947 to up until now in that span of a time. And I think it was a very difficult task to contain so much in that amount of space. But I want to begin with a very important point here. You know, there is a lot of talk about Asian order, and very rightfully, your book sort of brings back Indian focus on the region. Because there is a lot of discussion, as you also mentioned in your book, regarding superpower relations, regarding India itself becoming a superpower, and a lot of kind of noise around that. But somehow the critical region gets overlooked. So your book tries to bring Asia back into the strategic radar. But I want to begin with this fundamental question. How do we contextualize the Asian order today? In a sense, there is a lot of discussion about that. Some people say it's a multipolar Asia. Some people say it's an emerging Cold War. How do you contextualize the Asian order?
Well, the way I see it, and I think this actually is where the book is slightly different from conventional wisdom. Because the conventional wisdom is that we have moved from bipolar Cold War to unipolar post-Cold War moment, and since 2008 into multipolar. I think we are between orders still. And I think Asia's future order, we still don't know, because we are no longer in a unipolar situation in Asia. Maybe in the globe, militarily, there is only one superpower. Only the US can project military power anywhere across the globe today. So, but economically, globally, we are multipolar. It is true. There are other economies, big economies, China, Japan, others, which determine the course of the global economy. And politically, we're very confused. So globally, we're between orders, but even within Asia, this is not a unipolar Asia or an Asia centered either on China or on the US or on traditionally, and this is the point I make in the book, that traditionally for me, Asia consisted of multiverses. There was an East Asian order centered on China. There was an Indian Ocean world which had India at its center. And there was a West Asian order which had several regional powers, but the greatest of them was Persia or Iran. And we dealt with each other. We exchanged goods, ideas, religions, people, but we were not part of each other's political and security calculus until imperialism changed that. And that means that we actually lived in our own little worlds, separately, politically and in terms of security, and not in others. In fact, we were very open in terms of ideas. Today, Asia, if you look at it as a whole, it could go back to that. to local regional orders.
Mhm.
It could, I mean, there are great powers who I think seek primacy and dominance. I think the US, China would like an Asia centered on them, so centered on a single power. I think Belt and Road, all these are signs of that. But as I say in the book, I don't think that's likely. I don't think either of these is likely. I think what we are now in is a situation where several powers are rising simultaneously. It's not only China.
Mhm.
India is rising, Korea, Indonesia. There are established powers, Japan, Russia, Iran. These are, so it's a complicated situation. And it's much more like, if you need an analogy, like
Mhm.
late 19th century Europe, where there are several powers, different capabilities, some more powerful, some less, some bigger economic powers, and so on, some more technologically advanced, but all competing.
Mhm.
And all, therefore, and so there is actually a much greater risk to peace and security. And therefore, the situation you see today in Asia, all the flashpoints, all the hot points are live. You look at the India-China boundary, you look at Taiwan, you look at East China Sea, wherever you look, Yemen,
Mhm.
Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel,
Right.
everywhere you look, things are tense. And that for me is a sign of being between orders. And that's the way I see it.
Oh, that's interesting point, and you also very elaborate that in your book. But there is sort of a subtext, if I may just say this, where you that analogy of 19th century can be drawn parallel to. But there is one more phenomenon I think which we see in terms of conceptualization of order, is that while there is no political economic kind of there are divergences on that. There is another variable which is the ideational order,
Yeah.
in which we say about China is projecting one ideational concept when Xi Jinping talks about exporting socialism. And they've always had a different way of imposing of ideas from the West, right from the unipolar inception. So, which is what this study makes slightly complicated, because when we are actually even not on one page to look at two countries. We cannot analyze two countries through same variables. So
Yeah.
how do we put India in the larger Indo-Pacific so not Indo-Pacific, sorry, the Asian context? Is what is there a clash of idea of orders also?
There is an ideological contest. I mean, there is, but it's not so much. You see, China's ideology today
Mhm.
is no longer just China's traditional ideology.
Mhm.
It's the old Chinese ideology plus huge Western imports. I mean,
Okay.
Marxism itself is a Western import, but also the idea of the nation, the modern Chinese idea of the nation, is a modern development. It's a
Mhm.
19th, 20th century creation
Mhm.
out of civil war, out of dealing with the West, what they call the century of humiliation.
Right.
Uh, so and they are at the same time reluctant to pose it as an ideological challenge to the West. What they say is we offer an alternate model,
Right.
but they don't say we're in an ideological war. This is not like the Cold War,
Right. Right.
where they had a whole system theory. Why? Because they're huge beneficiaries of the existing Western order.
Right. Right.
Secondly, I don't think they feel they're ready for confrontation, that sort of confrontation. Thirdly, they can't cut themselves off. Their economic prosperity depends on the West.
Mhm.
They are interdependent, both.
Mhm.
In fact, they're codependent. So when we say there's a globalized world economy, which is why I think the best description of China-US relations today is as a hot peace, not as a Cold War,
Mhm.
because they are dependent on each other, but they have a hot relationship. But their quarrel here is much more straightforward. And this is why I use the 19th century European analogy.
Mhm.
It's a struggle for mastery. It's a struggle for dominance.
Mhm.
It's not an ideological struggle. And the Chinese have one fundamental problem in becoming an ideological power globally. They, what are they building in China? Their model is to build socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Right.
If it is with Chinese characteristics, how does it translate abroad? Then it becomes local.
Right. Right. Right.
They are not, Mao Zedong was spreading permanent revolution and communism across the world. That was a global ideology. But today it's Xi Jinping thought is socialism with Chinese characteristics. So they have to reconcile that themselves. So they have a problem there ideologically.
Mm.
What about for India? You know, we have a huge tradition of our own. And as I argue in the book, unfortunately, we swallowed this English version of our history, which they taught us to keep us as slaves.
Mhm.
And we swallowed that wholesale, which we shouldn't. I mean, we need to look at our own history with our own eyes and from our own position, our own geographical position, our own history. And that was a history of being connected to the world, of being open, and of being a net provider of knowledge to the world, of actually going out and engaging and working with the world. And that was when we did best as
Mhm.
India. And so the book is therefore a very strong plea for engagement abroad, for commitment abroad, and for staying engaged with the rest of the world, even if the world looks terrible, which frankly today it does. I mean, it looks like very uncertain. As I keep saying, I mean, ideology is not clear. You look at the military situation, it's not clear. Hotspots are all live. You know, there's an unbroken belt of weapons of mass destruction all the way from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, from Israel to North Korea. I mean, this is not a happy situation that we're in. So the temptation is, you know, ignore all this, let's go home and let's be safe. But that's not where our future, I think, prosperity, security lies, because you can't shut your doors to, in a globalized world, you can't shut your doors and windows.
So, if I may put it, it's a very deep liberal plea caught in the real politic world, so to say.
I'm not liberal. No, I don't think so. In fact, many liberals have a problem with, I think, what I say, because they say it's too statist.
Right.
They actually, so I don't, I'm very careful to avoid those, you know, whether I'm realist or whether I'm constructivist or all this liberal. I try very hard to avoid these labels. I'm
Right.
a practitioner.
Mhm.
And therefore, I like to think that I'm pragmatic about what I see and what I understand about around me.
Right. So bringing back to Asia, and this project, this piece of that there should be an Asia where it should revert back to times when Asia had its own sense of understanding each other, and they lived in their zones. So as you just pointed out, but talking about more contemporary times, you also talk about the initial attempts of Nehru sort of bringing about the Asian solidarity, sort of identifying that region. But it did not last for long, if I may put it that way. I mean, it sort of outlived its utility very early, and that also brings us to sort of India also trying to then, because its own neighborhood was fraught with certain competitions, India had to then sort of give away that Asian solidarity as a grand angle in its strategy. So, looking back, not back in terms of medieval, but in the more contemporary times, do you think that Asian solidarity is possible given the fact that non-Asian powers have a direct stake, and that situation, at least in foreseeable future, is unlikely to happen?
Uh, I think Pan-Asianism in
Hmm.
the first half of the last century and Nehru's attachment to the idea of Asia, I think that it was going against the fundamental type, which was, these were new states, don't forget.
Right.
PRC, Republic of India, all of it, we were all just getting independence, Indonesia, all of us getting independence from colonialism. We would naturally be nationalists. You
Hmm.
aren't then going to be cosmopolitan and open to all the rest of Asia and treat the world as your brothers.
Hmm.
I mean, there is no way that that was going to happen. So I think it might have been a good idea in terms of peace and so on, but it wasn't practical at that time. But
Hmm.
two things have changed. Today, if you look at it, the economy has been globalized. So
Hmm.
Asia is actually it's part of a much larger economic space. And all parts of Asia are actually linked. What happens in West Asia affects what happens in China, Japan, India, Korea, etc. Secondly, you look at technology, both military technology, missile ranges know no borders,
Hmm.
no boundaries. And in fact, they've grown to nor do nuclear submarines. But also other technologies, ICT, it's made boundaries and so on much more porous and much more irrelevant, frankly.
Hmm.
So technology and the economy have actually made Asia one space.
Hmm.
And the worrying part is it's become one space, but it's also become one battle space.
Right.
And it's brought, globalization has brought the center of gravity of politics, of the world economy here to Asia. So you must expect outside powers to be involved. They
Right.
will not go away. You can't say Asia for Asians and hope to enforce it today, because this is where all the action is. This is where the economic action is, politically, everything. And if the US is to prevent the rise of a peer competitor, it'll have to be done here.
Right.
And that's what she's doing with an Indo-Pacific strategy and so on. So we are, whether we like it or not, we are now at the center of global geopolitics. I mean, in the Cold War, we might have been a sideshow, and we could, say we'll ignore what happens in Europe, all that can go up. But today, we are at the center of this. So therefore, I don't think we can expect a return to the historical pattern of multiverses, No. In fact, I say it's possible, but it's unlikely in my mind today, because there are so many interests in this region, and there are so many revisionist powers. Nobody is happy with the present situation. Everybody wants to change it.
Right.
Now, if everybody is pushing and shoving and trying to change the situation in their favor, this is not a very stable situation.
Right.
So I also argue, therefore, that you can't aim for stability. You can't freeze this situation. I mean, existing powers might want to freeze it, but anybody who wants to rise, improve his stature, etc., he will say change it. So the best thing we can do right now is manage change and concentrate near at home, the subcontinent, the Indian Ocean region. These are critical to our security, to our prosperity. Work with them, keep them, and do much more with these areas. Of course, do the rest. I mean, engage with Southeast Asia, with West Asia. In fact, I think we need to, ultimately, we will have to play a much more active role in West Asia, even though it's very complicated. But for me, therefore, Pan-Asianism at that time, I think, didn't have a material basis and was also working against nationalism and the building of new states. Today, it has more hope, but again, it will be countered by existing powers who want to be involved, because this is where contention is going on.
It's interesting also mention Indo-Pacific, and while reading your book, it's almost as a sense that you're apprehensive about this concept of Indo-Pacific. At times, you stick to the Asia-Pacific as a constant.
I'll tell you how I use the terms, because for me, Indo-Pacific is only the maritime space, right? The east coast of Africa to the west coast of America.
Right.
Asia or Eurasia is the landmass,
right?
The continent, and this huge. And when I say Asia, I mean the whole Asian continent. Asia Pacific is both. Now, I'll admit I'm not always 100% consistent, I don't think. But in my mind, that's a distinction. When you talk of the maritime space, which is contentious, especially between China and the US, but others also, that's the Indo-Pacific. But ultimately, why do you want to control maritime space? In order to get to the land. Land is where people live, where things actually happen. So, for me, therefore, I think my preferred term is Asia. But when I say Asia Pacific, I mean both.
Yeah, in fact, you also very interestingly points out in your book, and you almost say that implicitly, that the Indo-Pacific concedes the continental order to powers other than US, China, and Russia, in a sense. So is it again sort of saying about the same order struggle that we are talking about? So when you say Indo-Pacific, that is one conceptualization. So you also see that kind of creeping into this kind of terminologies, so to say?
Yes, I think the words you choose, I think it really matters, because it reflects your thinking and your bias and your prejudices. For instance, the Quad, all the other three countries are basically islands as far as Asia is concerned. And they can be outside balancers. They can intervene when they want, and they can go home behind. India is both a maritime and a continental power, right? We have the world's biggest boundary dispute with China. We saw last year what happened on that border. You can't solve that problem in the Indo-Pacific. That problem you have to solve on the land border, on the continent of Asia. So we need both. We need to have a maritime strategy. We need a continental strategy. Continental strategy, frankly, countries like Iran, Russia, all these countries become very important
Right.
because these are countries who are there on the continent and for whom the continent really matters.
Mhm.
You know, when it comes to issues like Afghanistan and so on, what happens in Afghanistan will affect our security.
Right. Right.
But But the maritime powers, for them, this is secondary, or even maybe to much lower down on their list of priorities than it would be for us who are both continental and maritime. So that's why I say we need to look at it as Indians, from Indian eyes,
Mhm.
and think for ourselves in these situations. Work with whoever, work with everyone. We have common interests, we have congruence with the US, Japan, Australia, and the Quad. Work on maritime security, work on vaccines, work whatever. But we have other interests, work with the Iranians, work with the Russians.
Right. Yes, and interesting. We just talked about land boundary, and we've seen what that boundary can be, to what extent it can irritate our thinking. Which
Mhm.
brings us to China, which is sort of, no discussions today evades China. In terms, it has almost become a cliche. The rise of China and is reflections on India. But I sometimes, as a student, trying to understand this, I always face this kind of a question, and I want to put it to you: does India really have a China policy, so to say? And in a sense that, uh, has there ever been a kind of a thought out China policy which is sustainable and workable? Because what we say is that there are too many variables, I understand, in sort of creating China policy. There is the equation of the differential power differential between the two, the existence of external players. But do we really have a China policy uh, which is thought for future, is not just responsive or reactive, but is actually well laid out?
Well, I think, you know, about the rise of China, I think there's many questions about that itself. It's become a cliche, as you said.
Yes.
And there is also, I think the Chinese have worked very hard to create a sense of inevitability about the rise of China, right? That this is going to go on forever and there's no way that this can be stopped, etc. I have a feeling, though, that we need to sit and watch because China could have moved too early, could have done what Germany did, what
Right.
Japan did. We don't know.
Hmm.
And these are very ambitious goals she's declared for herself. And this Belt and Road, half of it doesn't make any money.
Hmm.
So is she going to support all these things forever? I don't know.
Hmm.
Frankly, it's difficult to say where the rise of China is going. And China does have internal issues. She has politics just like everyone else. And so China's trajectory, in my mind, is still a question mark.
Hmm.
And a lot of the assumptions people make in policy are for now, you can't make policy. Well, I think what you mean is a strategy for China,
Hmm.
unless you make certain assumptions for the future, right?
Hmm.
You can't make a strategy which will deal with the coming collapse of China when China rules the world
Right.
and an angry and frustrated China, but very powerful.
Hmm.
Any one of these scenarios is possible. Have we had a China strategy or policy? Yes, I think we've had a policy or a strategy, but no China strategy can have only an external dimension.
Right.
I think the external dimension we have actually figured out for quite some time, whether it was, and I think starting, with Narasimha Rao, with Prime Minister Vajpayee, under Manmohan Singh, basically it was the same strategy, and I think that's continued.
Hmm.
Large parts of it have continued in the present government. But the internal part of the strategy, because this is a long-term
Hmm.
strategy,
Hmm.
you can't do the external part without the internal self-strengthening, the other things
Right.
that are necessary. On that part, honestly, between you and me, I don't think we have done as well as we could have. We've done well. I mean, if you look at it, we started building infrastructure, the roads and so on in 2004,
Right.
long ago. We set up two more mountain divisions in
Right.
2010, set up Mountain Strike Corps in 2013. We opened up the advanced landing grounds where you see the planes landing on DBO and so on now. So government has been doing it, but the gap between us and China, not just the military gap, but even the economic gap. In
Hmm.
1980, we were roughly the same size economies, GDP, roughly the same technological levels. And in fact, India was more integrated into the world economy than China was.
Mhm.
Now, the Chinese economy is more than 4 times bigger. There is a military technological gap. Both are in the process of reforming their military. So we actually have new instruments which we're not quite sure how they will work on both sides.
Mhm.
And also, they are much more integrated in the world. It's very hard to think of any global supply or value chains which don't go through China. So they have a bigger say in the world economy, clearly, than we do. So that balance, that fundamental balance has shifted. And that can't be solved by an external or by foreign policy, diplomacy, even by external security policy. That's something that ultimately needs to be done at home. I think you had a group in Pune who did a lot of work on this recently and produced a strategy, which included Ambassador Gautam Bambawale and various people. The Pune International Center, I think they
Yeah.
put together a document. And I think they make the same point. You can't just run an external strategy or just an internal strategy.
Correct, correct.
These two are linked. And unless we do both, so, and I think on China strategy, actually, it's not something that divides Indians.
Hmm.
You know, Pakistan, maybe, yes, we have lots of differences among ourselves because everybody is a Pakistan expert.
Right.
But China strategy, I think you will get a fair amount of consensus among ourselves if we actually sit down and talk this through honestly among ourselves.
That also, on a lighter note, that also reflects that we have fewer China experts than Pakistan, which is why there is a
So
concept.
I always say we don't study China enough, but the Chinese don't study us enough either.
Mhm. That's true.
That is.
So, and I think what you pointed out is right. There is an internal component, and what generally happens is that, in the short term, probably internal balancing with China seems to be a distant dream, which is why we tend to focus more on external to sort of mitigate it. But in that race, probably internal component is not equally discussed, or that is probably the issue. Which is what, since we're talking about the external issues, and I think you also in your book point out how best we can sort of look at policy in the region, is it sort of, then are you trying to slightly suggest that we should probably be a kind of a non-aligned posture in Asia, trying to be equidistant or not choosing sides of either in the camps, or is that sort of alluding to that
No,
frame?
no. In fact, I think when I say strategic autonomy,
Mhm.
what I mean is keeping the freedom to work with whoever we want to, where our interests lead us.
Mhm.
So, in fact, it means the opposite. It means increasing your options to work with others rather than being neutral and saying no.
Right.
Neutrality is a negative concept, right? I won't pick sides. I
Mhm.
won't work. I'm saying the opposite. Autonomy means I will work with whoever works for me.
Mhm.
But I do say that we will work with different partners on different issues.
Right.
On maritime security, we have huge congruence with Japan, with the US, with Indonesia, with Singapore, with these countries. We work with them
Mhm.
in the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
But on other issues, let's say counterterrorism,
Mhm.
we need partners in West Asia
Mhm.
because some of our trouble comes from out of there.
Right.
We need partners whom we can work with in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
You know, so it depends on the issue. On cybersecurity, you'll have a whole different set of partners.
Right. Right.
And that's, for me, autonomy is a positive thing. It's you go out and actually work with people. Not that, oh, I won't talk to the Americans because the Chinese might feel offended.
Mhm.
They are not going to determine my policy. My policy I will determine based on my interests, my reading of my interests. And if it is in my interest to do something with the Americans, I'll do it. If it's in my interest to do it with the Chinese, I'll do it with them.
Mhm.
And this is why I say we shouldn't give anybody else control. Autonomy means we don't give other people control over what they don't have agency over our policy.
That's true.
And so whether it's buying S-400s from the Russians, they're the best
Right.
weapon available for that purpose in the world today.
Right.
Buy it.
Mhm.
It's for the Americans to give us an exemption if they feel they have an interest in their relationship with us.
That's
So so I see it slightly differently.
true. Mhm.
You know.
Yeah.
But it has to be in India's interest. I mean, there has to be a calculus there.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason why as I asked that was in a sense that, at times, especially in the fraud politics that we are right now in, sometimes, it has become, for instance, if you have to take on, for going back to what Prime Minister Modi said in Shangri-La dialogue, I think in a way he sort of restructured what India has been saying for long with regards to Indo-Pacific. But when you have an adversary who is trying to challenge that particular order, that itself then you puts you into an opposite. That may not be an alliance as such, but it is sort of what we therefore prefer terms of strategic partnerships rather than alliances.
Right.
So it and this is why, you also have been critical to these governments in almost in a sense that they have to certain extent compromised that autonomy. If I'm understanding your criticism right, uh, or, or do you think strategic partnerships are antithetical? Strong strategic partnerships are antithetical to strategic autonomy?
No, no, I don't think so.
Mhm,
I think military alliances are antithetical to autonomy because in an alliance you are committed to act if your neighbor is attacked or if something happens and so on.
mhm,
But I don't think partnerships are antithetical to autonomy, at least the way I define it.
mhm,
Uh, I might have differences with some of the tactics the government has adopted,
mhm,
maybe,
mhm,
or the way it presents certain issues and so on. But I don't say that the government has gone too far in terms of a partnership with the US,
mhm,
or I don't think anywhere in the book, I hope I don't convey that impression at all. No, in fact, where it's in our interest, and I think the result is clear, we today have better relations with the US than we've ever had before.
right.
And I think that's a good thing.
Mhm,
But that doesn't mean we won't be ready to have better relations with other people,
true,
you
true,
know. And I think we should make that absolutely clear to people.
right.
You're not going to determine what I do with anybody else, but neither does anybody else determine what I do with you.
That's true. Right,
I will determine.
right.
So if you want better relations with me, you better show me what
Mhm,
you're about, and I'm ready to sit and negotiate with you and talk it through with you. So
correct.
for me, that's the way to approach this,
Mhm,
rather than, oh, if I do this here, how will somebody else feel? They will always claim, oh, I feel terrible because they want to change your behavior.
right. That's true. No, that is important, and in a sense that there is a sense of continuity. So, but there is a departure in the way because even like you've mentioned in your book that the way this government dealt with China, we have it has resulted into a China which we never wanted. In a sense that we have almost brought the Chinese aggression on us, if that's what it is. So, how better could this government have handled China in sort of continuing with the previous government? Where this government went wrong, in a sense.
For me, I think that never forget the basics. China has changed her behavior. It is China's evolution and changed behavior which has led to the present crisis in India-China relations.
Right.
It's not a result of Indian actions. This is a result of Chinese actions.
Hmm.
The problem with what China has been doing is she has got increasingly assertive in her neighborhood since 2008, certainly after 2012, since Xi Jinping came to power. And you saw it in South China Sea, where she progressively militarized, and she did this sort of salami slicing, 2 steps forward, 1 step back,
Right.
and started applying it to us last year. Why did she think she could do that? Because frankly, I think we were a little too quick in declaring victory after Doklam.
Okay.
Because yes, we managed to face them down. Yes, we got them to agree to withdraw from the face-off spot, and we both withdrew.
Mhm,
After that, the Chinese came in and occupied the rest of the plateau. They left the face-off spot free,
mhm,
but they built 36 huts, 3 helipads, 3 tarred roads, and they have a permanent presence now on the Doklam Plateau, which they didn't used to have before
mhm,
2017. And they got the idea that, oh, let the Indians claim victory, but we can actually change the status quo.
mhm.
That, I think, was a dangerous idea once they got that idea.
Right.
And they tried it again last year, and we saw what happened. We had the first, deaths by enemy action on our borders in 45 years. And we saw the crisis that it's resulted in the relationship.
Mhm.
Now the Chinese are saying, no, no, let's move on. They've done what they have to, and they say, let's move on, let's do. No, no, we can't let the border determine. We should do business as usual. But obviously, I mean, India's not going to. The
Right.
government has made it quite clear, rightly,
Mhm.
that the precondition for business as usual is peace and tranquility on the border. And first disengage, and then we'll talk about where else we go. So for me, that's the problem. Somewhere between 2017 and 2020, the Chinese got the idea that they could get away with it.
Mhm. Okay.
And I hope that their experience last year and this year has convinced them that they can't.
Right.
In which case, we need to sit down and have a conversation with them and find a new equilibrium and restore deterrence on that border
Right.
in their mind, because deterrence is a subjective concept in their mind.
Right. Interesting. Thank you for that. And I just want to sort of wind up with this question in a sense that, a lot of contemplation about future that has been, and there is a lot of hope also in terms of because as you rightly pointed out, these disruptions actually give India an opportunity also in terms of how do you think then for the parting words will be the entire conceptualization of Quad heading to, which is it for a long time it's almost assumed like there is no concrete thing. I mean, everybody talks about it, but we don't know what it is. There are a lot of internal dissensions also. So, do you think that kind of a framework, like something which Modi mentioned in Shangri-La, it's sort of a non-adversarial and kind of an open framework, but which would be based on sovereign equality, freedom, and everything. So, how do you see Quad as a? Can it be a kind of a keystone for ordering Asia, as it were?
I think that 2018 Shangri-La speech by the Prime Minister was actually a very good speech
Mhm.
because it laid out a concept for all of Asia, which makes a lot of sense. And I
Mhm.
think ultimately, not just us, but others will have no choice but to come back to that broader, open conception of Asia, of a plural, inclusive Asia, where we take care of each other's security concerns. I mean, that idea, that broader conception, I think we will all have to come back to. And that is the traditional Indian idea of how Asia should be ordered.
Right.
Uh, Whether the Quad is the platform to do that or not, I don't know.
Mhm.
I think it has its limitations. As I said before, it's primarily a maritime security. It started with a maritime security focus,
Mhm.
and it still is. But I think it should remain, its future for me is as an open platform, which works with others and which becomes a provider of public goods, as it is doing from the last summit. It started on vaccines, started on resilient supply chains,
Right.
you know, and works with whether it's Korea, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Indonesia, ASEAN, whoever,
Mhm.
Singapore, works with each of them. It
Mhm.
has a primary interest in maritime security through the Indo-Pacific, and it should continue to do that,
Right.
continue to work on that. But it shouldn't become a, and therefore I think it will never become a closed, tight alliance. It's never going to be the NATO of Asia and so on, all these frightening words that
Mhm.
the Chinese try and use to give it a bad name.
Mhm.
But the fact is, it will be an open platform, inclusive, which will evolve with time and serve and produce public goods
Right.
for us all in Asia.
Right.
But it's not going to be the primary instrument for Asian security as a whole.
Right.
If at all there is any organization which could play a role like that, it's the East Asia Summit,
All right.
which includes most of the countries, but that excludes West Asia
Mhm.
from its consideration.
Mhm.
But that at least considers this whole, both the land and it includes all the powers, whether it's Russia, China, Japan, the US, etc., all of ASEAN, us, Australia, New Zealand. So, that if at all, that's really the platform that I would choose as a place to do this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador Menon. That was insightful. I'm sure all of us would have got a sense of what this book really offers. Uh, it's just my one reading, and I'm telling you, one reading is difficult to absorb. Lot many ideas which have been sold, so I'll be reverting back to that once again. Plus, please do read this book. The link for the book will be in the description section. Please tell us, what do you feel about this discussion? What do you feel about whatever we have discussed so far? And if there is anything, to let us know. Subscribe to this channel for more such discussion, more updates. And thank you, Ambassador Menon, once again for giving us time and discussing this very critical book with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was good of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. That's it from us.